If you were to look at Britain on a map today, you'd be forgiven for thinking that its borders only encompass those of the British Isles. But if you look at the world as a whole, you will find that there are actually 14 overseas territories, where the British government still holds power. From Gibraltar at the entrance of the Mediterranean, to the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. These are the last remaining possessions of Britain's once mighty empire. At the height of its territorial control a little over 100 years ago, the British Empire covered 1/4 of the globe's landmass and ruled almost a third of the world's population. It was the empire on which the sun never set. But how did such a small island nation become the largest and most powerful empire the world has ever seen? This is the history of the British Empire. The foundations of the British Empire were laid long before the state of Britain even formally existed. The dominant power in the British Isles throughout much of its history has been the Kingdom of England, with a well-developed economy and military force to match. England, during the medieval and early modern periods, came to rule over the smaller independent kingdoms in Wales and parts of Ireland. Although to the north, the Kingdom of Scotland remained a fiercely proud and independent nation, which had bitterly and successfully resisted frequent invasions from its powerful southern neighbor. By the early 17th century, Elizabeth I of England had issued several trading and exploration commissions to English adventurers with the intention of exploring and colonizing new territories yet to be claimed by other European powers. The likes of Sir Francis Drake and Sir Martin Frobisher claimed many lands in the name of England, but these were not followed up with settlements. The first English colony established in North America at Roanoke Island in 1585 failed dramatically, with the colonists mysteriously disappearing, never to be seen or heard from again. Elizabeth also granted several royal charters to joint stock companies that were established specifically for the purpose of developing overseas trade. Companies such as the Levant Company, founded in 1592, and the East India Company, founded in 1600, were granted monopolies on all English trade to and from these areas. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, the throne of England passed to James VI of Scotland. Upon his ascension to the throne, James became the king of both Scotland and England through the union of the crowns. However, the two kingdoms remained distinct and were ruled separately. As King James looked to build further on the attempts of his predecessor to establish overseas colonies, he considered three types of colony structures. A crown colony was directly ruled by the monarch themselves, but would typically be administered by a royally appointed governor and supported by a local council. A charter colony was similar to a crown colony, but was ruled under a corporate charter rather than a governor. These charter colonies often granted colonists significantly more political liberty compared to other colonies. A proprietary colony was governed by an individual who was typically the head of a joint stock company. These colonies were distinct from crown colonies in that they were commercial enterprises with responsibilities to shareholders. Proprietary governors typically did not live in the colony, and so appointed local governors and councils to rule in their absence. Over time, however, these proprietary colonies became increasingly difficult to manage and transitioned to crown colonies instead. An important yet often overlooked development in England's overseas expansion is that of the plantation of Ulster, which saw Protestant settlers from Scotland and England transported to parts of the north of Ireland during the early years of King James's reign. This model of organized colonization would form the blueprint for future English colonial expansion, with many of the leaders of the Ulster plantation later becoming involved in establishing other colonies in the New World. Throughout the 1600s, the Kingdom of England expanded its overseas colonies in North America and the Caribbean. Some were entirely new ventures, whereas others were annexed from rival foreign powers, like New York, which was seized from the Dutch in 1665. England also significantly developed its trading networks in Africa and the East Indies. With the building of factories and fortified trading posts, a critical component to this mercantile success was the creation of the Royal African Company in 1660, which over the subsequent decades would become the leading participant in the brutal yet highly lucrative transatlantic slave trade. During this period, Scotland also began to establish overseas colonies of its own, having looked on somewhat enviously at the successful endeavors of the English. Unfortunately, almost all these attempts ended in failure, with colonies in Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, and Carolina barely lasting a few years. The most abject failure of Scotland's colonization attempts, however, came in 1698 with the Darien Scheme. This aimed to establish a colony controlling the overland trade route of the Isthmus of Panama between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. To finance the expedition, an immense amount of capital was raised from the public, which accounted for almost a fifth of the wealth in Scotland at that time. When the ships arrived at the coast of Darien, they named the colony Caledonia and set about constructing a settlement called New Edinburgh. The attempts of the colonists, however, were to ultimately prove futile, as the settlement quickly succumbed to food shortages, tropical disease, and attacks from nearby Spanish forces. Despite a resupply in 1699, the settlement was abandoned, and the survivors, who totaled just a few hundred of the original 2,500, returned to Scotland in disgrace. Due to the total disaster of the Darien Scheme and the loss of public money that had been invested into it, Scotland was plunged into a financial crisis. Many then considered that their best and only chance of being part of a major power would be to share in the benefits of England's colonial enterprise. By the turn of the 18th century, England and Scotland remained independent kingdoms, although the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had dramatically shifted the political landscape within the British Isles. The Catholic James II was deposed and replaced with his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William, who became King William III of England and Scotland. Legislation was passed in England so that only Protestants could inherit the throne, but this law did not apply in Scotland. And so, under the reign of Queen Anne in the early 1700s, efforts were made to unite the parliaments of both nations and secure a Protestant line of succession for the monarchy. When the Acts of Union were passed in 1707, England and Scotland were then united into one kingdom under the name of Great Britain. Over the following decades, Britain became involved in several wars with other European powers, which were fought not only on the continent, but also wherever their overseas colonial interests lay. After the War of the Spanish Succession, concluded in 1714, with a victory for Britain and her allies, peace negotiations granted territorial concessions from the defeated French and Spanish. Newfoundland and Acadia in North America passed into British control, as well as the strategic Mediterranean islands of Gibraltar and Minorca. Meanwhile, the British East India Company, which was not technically part of the empire, but nevertheless still pursued its colonial interests, was engaged in military operations against its French counterpart across the subcontinent. The aftermath of the Battle of Plassey in 1757 wrested control of Bengal away from the local Nawab ruler and his French allies, leaving the British to become the leading military and political power in the region. This acted as a springboard for the British East India Company,